Scotland. I am greetings from St. Andrews in Scotland, and it's quite an interesting cloudy day, but I'm really pleased to be here to talk about this issue. What I'm going to start off now with is to share my screen. Now, I've put a link in the chat box for everybody to access a Padlet that I've created here to share your thoughts, views, or whatever. It's really interesting. Some of the points I think I agree with. The Indian Ocean is amazing. I went swimming in the Indian Ocean near the coast of Lamu, and that was gorgeous. So, I don't know about this place called Four, but it sounds brilliant. So I'm going to research that, look into that. But thank you for sharing. Keep sharing information. It's really good to get a feel for everybody. But I'm going to start now by sharing my screen about my talk today, which I'm going to start now. If I could just get this to work. This seems to be acting up. Hang on. Advanced. Hang on, I seem to be having an issue with sharing my screen. Oh dear. Give me a minute. I have to, honestly, it's typical. Right, let's try again. Share screen. Yay, I think we're there. I hope everybody can see it. Let me just begin. Brilliant. So welcome everybody to this little seminar I'm having. I've titled it The High Seas, where I'm looking at change in international law. Again, you know, the Padlets, please utilize that if you wish to share any thoughts or any information with the group. It's great. I'll be referencing the Padlet as I go on. A bit about me. I'm Dr. Nkeiru Scotcher. I'm a research fellow in ocean governance and the law of the sea with the University of Gothenburg in Sweden. I'm also affiliated with the Free University of Brussels in Belgium, where I got my PhD in international law. I'm also a lawyer qualified to practice in England and Wales jurisdiction. So, and I've had over a decade of experience and involvement in the law of the sea issue and ocean governance. I'm currently on the joint task force team with the ITU, working on utilizing smart cables for climate monitoring and disaster warning systems. So that's quite an exciting science-based venture that's going on now in ocean governance. So this is really something I'm passionate about and have lived it for quite a while. In terms of what I'm really drawn to, though, with the law of the sea and ocean governance, I'm always drawn to giving voice to small-scale regional actors and regional players and stakeholders who I feel really are the ones who are closer to the ground and are able to really bring to the international fora issues that are dear to them and issues that affect them. So this is something I've worked with in my research, and I'm always interested in that sort of link between politics and law, and this is reflected in my research in the law of the sea. Please get in touch if you want to chat, and if you want to get in contact with me via email, I'm also on LinkedIn. Right, now going to the meat of really what we want to talk about today. What I've really done here is design what I call a not so trivial trivia. It's kind of like a quiz. I'll ask a few questions and then you put your answers in tablets and then we'll talk about it and I'll kind of expand upon it. So it's kind of a way to keep this a bit more interactive, but also get us to look at some of the issues and draw attention to some of the issues that we have in relation to the high seas. Okay, so without wasting any time, I'm moving to the first question, which is a yes or no answer. And please go to the tablet link, which is in the chat box, to put your answers there. And the first question really I'm putting to you, attendees, is, as areas beyond national jurisdiction, the high seas are not covered by any international treaty or agreement. So do you think yes or no to this question? What are your thoughts? I'm going to give you a bit of a minute or two, and then I'm going to deal with that in my answer. I will check again that everybody has, I'm hoping that we all have the link to the Padlet to put in our answers. No. Interesting. Thank you. No. Oh. Right. This is great. Well, all right. Okay. I'm getting a lot of no's, so it would appear that lots of us feel that it's not covered by any international treaty and agreement. And I agree. The answer is no. As areas beyond national jurisdiction, the high seas are covered by a number of treaties and agreements, but there is no one central treaty or agreement that deals with it. The most prominent treaty that looks at the high sea and really defines the nature of the space is the Law of the Sea Convention, okay, of 1982. But this convention was of its time. And in this convention, it really prioritized the state territory in the maritime domain. And just to put it simply, it really was about what states can do where. And that was what the Law of the Sea was about. But in the high seas, with the high seas, what we have is like a whole mixture of sector by sector impact and influence in the region. So you have treaties that talk about and look at shipping for one. So this is regulated by the IMO. You have conventions like the Safety of Life at Sea Convention, the Suppression of Unlawful Acts Convention. And that's that sector for the shipping sector itself, but also then touches upon activities in the high sea. For the fishing sector, you have regional fisheries management organizations, and they have so many different kinds all over the world. But here, this is where I think we have the problem with the high seas. These mechanisms, all of them, if you look at all these different sectors, they're really not dealing with the issue of conservation, and they're not dealing with the issue of marine biodiversity loss. And so also there's a lack of integration between all of them. So in some ways there's a tunnel vision per sector. And what we have to think about here, and I think a lot of us would probably agree with this, is that, is this really the way to approach the high seas? It being that, approximately half of the planet's surface and a substantial part of its biodiversity is beyond national jurisdiction. To treat it in this sort of sector by sector basis creates some sort of disjointed system, because you have issue-based approach, whereas there should be much more of an ecological unity in the way that the high seas is approached. Okay, now moving on to my next question, which is, so, to put it simply, the law is at the moment insufficient in relation to the high seas. The next question I will put to us is decision makers. So what do you think? Are there any decision-making institutions or agreements acting in the high seas on this basis? Yes or no? What are your thoughts on that? Still no. Yeah. I can see, yep, most of the participants are putting in no, yep. Again, building on what I said earlier, with the high seas, there is no centralized agency. And so what we have is a system where there's several institutions and several agreements that are mandated to regulate activities. And even when you look at the high seas itself, the very subsoil and the body and the ocean floor is regulated by a completely separate convention and institution. And so it's a difficult one, because in terms of decision-making institutions, there is nothing centralized, but there are decisions being made that are handled on a kind of disjointed sector by sector basis. When you think about conventions such as the Convention for Biological Diversity, which was the first convention that dealt with conservation of biological diversity, it was interesting because it recognized the environmental challenges that we're facing, and that this is a collective issue that needs to be dealt with globally. But it didn't go beyond to areas beyond national jurisdiction. It only stuck within, again, areas that are within states' jurisdiction, okay? And what about other treaties and agreements? When we look at the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, remember again that it was also negotiated at a time when the connection between the oceans and the impacts of climate change was also not prioritized by states. And so what we see here when we think about it as lawyers, it would appear that the way law works is it kind of is a problem and then it finds a solution for the problem. And so the problem dictates the solution. When states are seeing issues of territory or sovereignty as the problem, then of course the solution will take that same trajectory. And so that's where we are really in this. And so next question I'm going to ask you based on this is, then what decision makers do we have? When we know that there are no treaties and there's sort of a disjointed system, do you think there are decision makers involved in the high seas? Can you identify any? What do you think? I've put A, B, C, D, E. If you feel that none of those options apply, you can also say none of the above, but I'm going to sort of talk through to you what I think. All right. E. Mm-hmm. Mm. Any other views? Except E. I've got a E. A and C. Thank you, guys. Your points on your favorite spots. I've been making notes of all these places that sound amazing. Seychelles, I want to go to. I've heard amazing things, and I've got some colleagues who've worked there, and it's Slovenia. Wow. Yes, I have a friend from Kerala, and yeah, I've heard amazing things about that place. Oh. So we've got E's and then ACs and ABs. So this shows us actually, in some ways, it reflects the situation on the ground, and it reflects the kind of how it's all over the place. When, oh, right, Angela reckons A and D. Oh, Deborah reckons E as well. Well, the answer to this is E. Why do I say that? I will walk you through this. Now, A is states. When it comes to the high seas, what matters here is the activity that's going on in the high seas. And what are these activities? I've mentioned a few of them, like shipping and fishing. These are activities that occur via ships or vessels, and these vessels are flagged by states and flagged to states. So these vessels are registered to states. And so the states are they're the ones that are responsible for the activities of these vessels in these waters. And I say, two, the international organizations are also decision makers here. And the officials of these international organizations are, such as the IMO or regional fisheries management organizations, because they are the ones who are putting forward agreements and regulations and what states can do and what vessels can do in these waters. So they too are decision makers in this field. Now, when I talk about the regional fisheries management organization, I will probably mention a few, per area. You have in the Northeast Atlantic, you have the Northeast Atlantic Fisheries Commission, Northwest Atlantic Fisheries Commission. You've got one in the Mediterranean, the General Fisheries Commission for the Med. You have one in the north tip of Brazil in the Western Central Atlantic. So there's so many regional organizations who are really involved in monitoring activity in these areas of the high seas. Also, I have to say judges and specially constituted arbitral tribunal. Yes, I will share my email afterwards, Ali Mami. Just give me a minute. There are also judges whose job is to hear disputes on a matter. And when parties have varying interpretations in relation to a case, the judge can then make a decision and lead and make a decision in relation to this dispute. So sometimes this process of going to the courts can lead to establishing of a rule. We see this in ocean governance and maritime disputes between states. So D, I said it depends on the actor. It really is best illustrated by example. Shipping, again, I go to, is an international activity. 90% of world trade occurs via ships, and these ships move through the high seas. But shipping is governed by national laws. And so there are many actors coming together, trying to harmonize rules and impacts in terms of what's going on here. And the regulatory instruments are created by the IMO, and these apply to ships, they apply to ship owners, they apply to charterers. So in terms of decision makers involved in the high seas, there are numerous. And so it is something to bear in mind for you as campaigners, and it's something to bear in mind for you moving forward in terms of how you can create a campaign. Now, this is it for our quiz. I'm now going to move into my next question, which is what your campaign can influence, okay? And that's here. Now, I think sometimes when we look at international law, we find ourselves stuck in that mindset of, oh, this is interminable. This is not, there's no way forward with this. I can't see myself having a voice or being heard here. But it's important to remember that decision-making and decision makers are not just regurgitating rules or inherited rules. They still have to weigh factors and policies that are significant in the context before coming to decisions. This happens in the courts. This happens regionally. This happens with national bodies. And so these factors and these policies are extensive, and they are multiple, right? And interests at play are multiple. We see this recognition of the impact of campaign and influences in the law of the sea, especially when we look at the development of the law of the sea itself. The convention started off having, we had this convention in 1980. It was very state-centered, anthropomorphic. Nothing really looked towards the oceans and how it's an ecological unit. But then, of course, there was activism and voices from NGOs, from academia, from science. There was a lot of input in that. And these voices were highlighted, during the Rio conferences in 1992 and even afterwards. And they all highlighted the need for a more ecologically uniform policy. And what did that lead to? It created this concept of ecosystem approach, the way in which we look at management measures, not just from a state-centric one-dimensional, what is mine approach, but look at it as an ecological unit. And the need for the precaution approach, where even without knowing all the facts, states and regions can put in place measures that can actually pause some of the detrimental activities that humans are doing in our oceans. So what we see is, with respect to what your campaign can influence, it is important to bear in mind that having a voice matters here, and amplifying that voice is important regardless. And it's not just something that has to come from a state perspective. NGOs and activists and small scale bodies and stakeholders can still impact and change rules in law. And this is something to bear in mind, okay? This is something that we see. I talk about the law of the sea. This was reflected again further on by the Convention for Biological Diversity. This is the first convention where it looked at conservation of biological diversity and broadened and brought into the discussion this whole idea of marine protected areas, right? This was something that was unknown back in the day in the law of the sea, but now has come into the forefront of affairs and recognized as something that it can be valuable in stemming the climate crisis and biodiversity loss. And so what we now have is, we are now poised for this concept to be further enshrined in law, not just within national jurisdiction, but beyond it. And this is what is exciting, I think, about this new treaty that's been regulated. It's a very long treaty. It's got the longest name ever. It's called, the draft agreement under the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea on the conservation and sustainable use of marine biological diversity of areas beyond national jurisdiction. Some refer to it as the High Sea Treaty, some refer to it as the BBNJ Treaty, but I think that what we see here is that we're poised for the enshrinement of key principles now in law that apply beyond a state's jurisdiction. And this is why this treaty is needed and why it's important. It is needed in the sense there's now a real possibility to enshrine in law principles that are ocean focused, principles such as marine protected areas, environmental impact assessments, capacity building, and technology. And so that's really where we are now with this. And I think hopefully by the time that negotiations are complete and this treaty comes into force, we will have now principles that filter down into national and regional legislation that really prioritizes the living systems in the ocean. And that's it for my little talk. I will end it by putting a quote that I love poetry, and this is by a South African poet called Masisi Kunene, which says, all truth must be born of saying. It is important that we remember that having that conversation in itself and bringing that issue out into the open is a start, and it's a very important start. Before we even get to the point where we have a treaty or an agreement in place, we need to get our voices out there and amplify issues that we think are essential in ocean governance and the law of the sea. So yes, I've got a track coming up in the summit. So if you've got a campaign or anything you would like to discuss in relation to that, please join up, and I will be mentoring that track at the summit. I'm going to go back now to my email because a few of you asked for my email address. Here it is at the start. But I love some of your points. Thank you so much. I agree with you, Ali. We need action this time. Less talk, more action, please. And yes, I have to say that I agree with all your points on regulating fisheries, no industry, clean it. Oh gosh, you guys are all singing my song, and I really am looking forward to more collaboration and interaction with you. And thank you again for all your points on your favorite spots. I've made little notes and I'm going to look into them. But yes, please put anything or write to me if you'd like to discuss further on this. But this is it for my track. I didn't want to put too much law in there, but I just want to say, as campaigners, keep speaking. The time for action is now, and we can't stop and get derailed. Thank you. Oh, I think